Good morning, Dan and Amy. Well, New Year's Eve, there was another terrible terrorist attack in Istanbul, which has been kind of a hotbed of terrorist activity in the last few months. A nightclub where 39 people were murdered by a terrorist who's still at large.
Yeah, and this morning they released, he had a selfie video that he had taken, and so they released his image around the world. So hopefully they'll catch him soon. And then there was one American who was there, a man from Pennsylvania who's a contractor. He was at the nightclub when it was happened, got shot in the leg.
I was probably the luckiest person in the whole thing. I do find myself very fortunate. I was with 9 people, 7 of us were shot.
And all of his friends lived, but the way he survived, Dan, was he played dead.
He was walking on a bench above my head where my head was underneath. When he shot me, I didn't move. I just let him shoot me.
So that's Jake Rock. And by the way, this morning he's on his way back home.
Well,
he's leaving Istanbul.
For more on this attack and the implications of it, particularly with a new administration and perhaps a new approach to counterterrorism, we're pleased to be joined again by our friend Dr. Zuhdi Jasser, who's the president and founder of the American Islamic Forum for Democracy. He's also a former U.S. Navy lieutenant and commander, and he's the author of the book, A Battle for the Soul of Islam. Dr. Jasser, thanks for joining us again. Appreciate it.
Oh, it's great to be with you. Thanks for having me.
And so what does the spike in terrorist activity in Istanbul and Turkey, what does that mean for the Trump administration counterterrorism imperatives as he, is weeks away from inauguration?
Well, I think Turkey is basically a clinic for all of the problems that we have. I think it's easy for the Erdogan regime, the president of Turkey, to make himself out to be a victim of the refugees. And they did take in over 500,000 into Turkey. But that's not what's happening. In the past 6 months, they've had a huge uptick in their attacks from ISIS, because this is, make no mistake, an internecine battle within the Islamist movement. And the battle happening inside of Turkey is that you had an AKP party, which is the Muslim Brotherhood of Turkey, in charge over the past 12, 13 years. And Erdogan has in the past few months shifted completely and gone from supporting ISIS, supporting the radicals in Syria against the Assad regime that Turkey had supported for 50 years. And now doing a 180 and deciding to become part of the dictators club in the Middle East and working with Putin and deciding to keep Assad in power and has abandoned the Islamists. So the grassroots AKP Islamists are pretty upset in Turkey. Basically, for Americans and for Trump, both sides are enemies of America, be it the AKP party or be it Erdogan and the dictators club in the Middle East, be it from Saudi Arabia or the friends of Assad on the Shia Islamist movement. So these internecine battles, we need to rise above. We need to figure out a third pathway. And the only way I think Trump is going to succeed is if he begins to navigate a third pathway in the Middle East, which is separate from the dictators of Assad, Putin, Khomeini, and the monarchs of the Middle East, and different from the grassroots viral movements of the Islamists, of the AKP, ISIS, etc.
Now, ISIS quickly claimed responsibility for this attack. Do you believe that this man was acting alone? Was he a lone wolf, or is he being really supported by ISIS?
Well, at the end of the day, the way the movement of ISIS works is they don't necessarily have agents like Al-Qaeda did, and they send them for operations. They're a viral jihadist movement. Jihad is basically a militant end justifies the means movement. It's a viral type ideology. So while they'll take credit for it, odds are they have so many feelers out on the internet and imams that are supporting them, as we saw in Germany with the vehicular terror that happened in the Christmas market. There's no direct coordination, but it's like an intoxicant, be it cocaine or any other type of intoxicant. Once it gets into the mind, it will act, and ISIS will take credit for it because their intoxicant is any Islamic State ideology and any antipathy and animus against the West and freedom and secular states.
Yeah, and so, I mean, that's the way you describe that suggests that it's going to be more soft targets, marketplaces, nightclubs. That's where we should expect frankly, the place that we would think would be the safest, and we've had this conversation before, the place, the Orlando nightclub, who would think, right? But these soft targets is where you're going to see these attacks.
Exactly. And this is a long war. We are at war with an ideology. And the seeds of that ideology are those who are separatists who believe in a global Islamic movement. Israel, for example, has lived with vehicular terror and many forms of terror for over its 60-plus years of existence, and especially in the last few decades as they buckled down on more conventional means and weapons. And yet they've continued to be a free, secular society and continue to exist in the normal life. And I hope it doesn't become a new normal for us in the West. We have to recognize that we're at war, but also recognize that we can't change our way of life. We can't become isolationists globally, because that's exactly what the Islamists want. They want to fill the vacuums of the Arab awakening. They want the secular free movements that were part of the Arab awakening to die off. And they want us to withdraw from our influence abroad, be it through social media or elsewhere. And that's why I hope we begin to have a domestic and global plan under Trump to begin to advance the ideas that are the only counterterrorism that's possible. Terrorism is only a tactic. The root ideology is the allegiance to the Islamic State mentality.
I want to go back to what you mentioned previously about that third way or the third path that Trump needs to forge, particularly as it relates to this growing dictators club of allies of convenience: Iran, Turkey, Russia, Syria, China, I guess to some extent as well. Give us some sense of what you think that third way should or could look like.
Well, I think in your backyard there, you had a conference a week ago where the Islamic Circle of North America and the Muslim American Society had a Chicago conference that brought the daughter of Erdogan in and recognized her as a great leader of a great government. If that's the third wave, we're going to fail miserably. The Islamist apologists are the problem, in that they don't see terrorism as a product of political Islam and the Islamic State. They see it as an aberration. I hope Trump's policy will include embracing the Muslim reform movement, folks that are Muslim that counter the Islamic theocratic mindset, and basically begin to look and say, well, the Middle East is not stuck between a death match between theocrats and secular dictators. And this is what I hope comes out on the Tillerson hearings as we look at his appointment, and that I hope he's not part of the old global economic establishment. I hope we begin to see that the Middle East, be it the people of Egypt that rejected the Brotherhood, the people of Tunisia that have rejected the Ennahda Islamist movement, but the secular movements are suffering. They're dying on the vine, as we see in Syria, because this last administration, Obama administration, for 8 years has abandoned completely any type of strategy in the Middle East in an information war. And I hope we begin to have an information war like we did in the Cold War, and begin to produce ideological movements like we did with Radio Free Europe, and have a Radio Free Islam, Radio Free liberty throughout the Middle East, to put our so-called allies like Saudi Arabia and others on notice that we will no longer tolerate theocracy as allies.
Now, during the months leading up to the election, there were several interviews with ISIS members, and a lot of them said that they were rooting for Donald Trump. Why do you think that is?
Well, ISIS is an eschatological end-of-times ideology. They want the world to be in flames because they have a scorched earth mentality that the more war there is, the better. So they're just sort of looking at the tip of the iceberg of what Trump represents, which is war against ISIS. The reality, as Americans, I see Trump as a much better improvement from what we've had, in that the extinguishing of ISIS's flame is the only way you're going to see liberty movements evolve. But that also has to mean the extinguishing of Assad, the extinguishing of other dictatorships as not being repositioned in a position of strength in the Middle East, because you can't get rid of the ISISes or Al-Qaedas of the world without also seeing a transformation away from the dictatorships of Assad and the monarchies of the Middle East. So, yeah, ISIS is going to say that. That's their pitch to, this is an organization who targeting innocents at a Christmas market is the way they recruit further jihadists too. So we can't rationalize and affect our policy based on what end of times radical militants use to recruit further jihadists.
And to paraphrase William F. Buckley, the saint of William F. Buckley, beware of any one or any group that attempts to eminentize the eschaton. He is Dr. Zuhdi Jasser, president of the American Islamic Forum for Democracy, that is, former U.S. Navy lieutenant commander, author of the book, A Battle for the Soul of Islam. Dr.